From the McCourtney Institute for Democracy on the campus of Penn State University, I'm Michael Berkman.
I'm Candace Watt-Smith.
I'm Jenna Spinelli, and welcome to Democracy Works. This week, we are talking about marijuana legalization, and our guests are Dan Mallinson, who is an assistant professor of public policy and administration at Penn State Harrisburg, and Lee Hannah, who's an associate professor of political science at Wright State University. They're both Penn State alums. They received their PhDs in political science here at dear old State, and they've been studying and thinking about marijuana policy for the past couple of years now. And, you know, this is a topic that's been on my list of potential episodes for a while now, but there's a couple of things that have happened, particularly since the election, that I think make it very timely and very topical to be talking about right now.
So there have been, even since the election, a number of things that have happened. And I really like thinking about this topic. It's one of the topics that my students like to write a lot about. And so between them and Dan and Lee, I think that this topic is really important because it hits a lot of the issues on the Democracy Works bingo card. You know, it highlights the role of citizen-led initiatives. It highlights the gap between what people want and what policymakers are willing to do, the complexity of federalism. I'm sure, state laboratories. I don't know. What else, Michael?
So much that we've talked about at other times, thinking about how legislatures kind of get in the way of public opinion and what the public would like to do. And so some of the differences with direct democracy and indirect democracy. But also, it really is an interesting federalism issue, isn't it, Candace? I mean, on the one hand, you have some states just moving in the opposite direction of where the federal government has been, which creates a kind of odd compound republic situation. And you also see states both in competition with one another around marijuana policy and also learning from one another.
Yeah, I think I should also like to note that it's going to be both kind of this policy is also highlighting where the United States stands in the kind of larger global scheme too. So Canada has legalized marijuana and Mexico is thinking about doing it. And, most Americans are okay with it, but we see a lag among our policymakers. And so, we'll see how it plays out, right?
Yeah, I mean, Dan and Leo lay it out, but just to kind of give our listeners an idea of what we're talking about here. In lots of states, medical marijuana is legal, and more and more states now, recreational marijuana use is legal. But at the federal level, it is still entirely illegal. And because of that, the cannabis industry at the state level is really constrained. I mean, not only is there always the possibility of arrest for violating federal crimes while you're not violating state crimes, but it means that there are restrictions on how involved they can be with the banking industry.
It's a cash business, right? Because the money can't be protected by FDIC. Everyone is kind of talking out of two sides of their mouth too, as well, right? Because on the one hand, people want to tax it and make revenue, but then you don't necessarily want to insure it because it's illegal at the federal level. The other thing I think is worth noting is that when marijuana policies hit the ballot, it tends to win.
It is. It's like one of those common ground issues that I think you and I talked about the last time we met. That just seems to have a large amount of support in the public. And so when they're put on the ballot in direct democracy, they're generally going to pass. And actually, as I remember it, all of the initial marijuana legalization bills, certainly the early medical marijuana ones, like in California, did pass through the initiative or referendum or through some sort of direct democracy technique. And that's why we saw it so much broadly in the West than it took the East much longer to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the framing, another reason why I think this policy is really helpful to think about in terms of democracy is because the framing matters. So, if people are talking about veterans and PTSD, children
Right.
with epilepsy, that might influence people to think about it differently. I think it might also, right, given that, a good number of college kids in frat houses are using marijuana, and what parents want their kids to be criminalized under these policies.
Bringing it back around to democracy and some of the ways that the issues are being framed is a good segue into the interview. We do talk about framing issues. We talk about laboratories of democracy, federalism, all of those things. So let's get to the interview with Lee, Hannah, and Dan Mallinson. Dan and Lee, welcome to Democracy Works. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I'm excited to talk with the two of you today about marijuana policy. I know it's an issue you've been studying for the past several years now. We've certainly seen lots of changes as states continue to pass both medical and recreational legalization. And, before we dive into some of the specifics, I thought it might be helpful just to get a broad lay of the land about kind of where things stand, particularly because there have been so many states passing these measures over the past couple of years. So, Lee, why don't you kick us off? How many states have legalized marijuana either for recreational or medicinal purposes, and what have some of those trends been over the past couple of years?
Sure. So we have 35 states and the District of Columbia that now have medical marijuana programs. And these date back to 1996. California was the first state to adopt. And we essentially see this trend with medical marijuana adoptions where you have early on, legislators don't really want to touch the issue. And so we see states with both more liberal populations as well as access to the ballot initiative that can essentially move ahead of the legislature and pass these policies. And so of the first 5 laws that were passed, 4 of those were through the ballot initiative. And so that trend kind of continues on through the Bush administration. You kind of see a slowing of adoptions. And then really since Obama, we've kind of seen this uptick that really didn't stop in the Trump administration. And if I had a map in front of the listeners, what they would see is that early on, it's kind of the likely suspects. It's deep blue states, it's Western states that either have kind of a libertarian or a liberal bent to them. And then as you start to see during Obama and the Trump administrations, the policies move into more conservative states, places like Arkansas and Oklahoma and the Dakotas. And so that's kind of the trend line in medical marijuana policies. If you look at recreational, you start back in 2012. And again, it's the ballot initiative that has really facilitated the expansion of recreational policies. And from 2012 now to here in 2020, we now have 15 states that have recreational. So the adoptions are coming a bit faster. It's kind of a steeper curve if you look at kind of a plot of these on a on an adoption plot, and what we're seeing is that for the most part, with one exception, every state that is adopting recreational already has a medical policy in place, which kind of makes sense that they would start there and then build off of that infrastructure that's already in place.
So Dan, as Lee was just saying, many of these laws have been passed through the ballot initiative process. Can you talk a little bit about how that process plays out with this issue in particular? Like what types of groups are involved? Who's getting the ball rolling? What does that look like in terms of organizing this issue on the ground in these states?
Sort of think of these as grassroots efforts, right, where citizens can develop a law that they want to see and get enough signatures from other citizens to get it placed on the ballot. And then that allows their fellow citizens to vote on it and potentially vote it into law. What we see, though, with ballot initiatives is it tends to be more complex than that. And there are large interest groups as well as industry involved in developing the initiatives and in funding the signature gathering campaigns, which require a lot of resources to get, in some cases, several 100,000 signatures to get a bill on the ballot. So you do see pretty large involvement from interest groups like the Marijuana Policy Project and Normal, who've been working in this space for quite some time. But there are also local, on the ground activists that are also helping to coordinate these efforts. But increasingly over time, too, as the legal marijuana market has developed and has matured, you do increasingly see influence from the marijuana industry in the shaping of these ballot initiatives and in trying to shape what the specific details of the marijuana laws look like.
What arguments or what framing are these groups using as they're crafting the language for the ballot initiative itself and perhaps more importantly building support for it?
Dan was talking about these interest groups that have been so vital to the efforts to get these bills passed. But beyond just your kind of marijuana specific interest groups like Marijuana Policy Project and Americans for Safe Access and some others, you also have groups that are representing veterans, groups that are representing families that have kind of formed these support groups and lobbying groups that are dealing with like epilepsy and children dealing with that. You're seeing more discussion about kind of broader harm reduction, whether that's related to the opioid epidemic or mass criminalization, mass imprisonment. There's a number of kind of new groups that have seen something in marijuana policy as, worthy of pursuing. States that may be very competitive, kind of at the Republican, Democratic gubernatorial race or presidential race, we're seeing that marijuana initiatives are increasingly passing, by 60, 70% margins. And so in that way, I think that it's symbolic that more broadly, a lot of this communication is working. And when they can get in front of a voting public, they tend to win.
Yeah. So what's going on here with that disconnect, or I guess is there still a disconnect between state officials, people in state legislatures, and the people that they're supposed to represent? You guys said at the very beginning that this wasn't something that legislators wanted to touch. Is that still the case? Are they coming around at all, and do you see any evidence that things might be changing as far as whatever the incentives for people in office might be as far as considering this issue?
So I think public officials are coming around slowly. Clearly, Democrats and more liberal public officials have have largely already come around on this. It wasn't until just in 2016, though, that so if you look at public opinion, Gallup has been asking about marijuana legalization for a long time, all the way back into the 70s. There's been a clear and fairly rapid shift from, it was about 12% of the population supported marijuana legalization in the 70s to now it's just under 70%. And that's the overall population. If you break that out into Republicans and Democrats, it's something like the high 80s. But it wasn't until 2016 that you had a slim majority of Republican respondents to the Gallup survey indicate that they supported marijuana legalization. But it's been difficult in states like Pennsylvania, who do not have the ballot initiative, to get traction on, or I should say more conservative states like Pennsylvania, to get traction on an issue that actually has a lot of public support. Oklahoma is a really good example of this. Oklahoma is, we think of it as a pretty solid red conservative state, but Oklahoma passed medical marijuana in 2018, and it passed it handily. I think it was 57% support. And it looks like recreational is on its way to being on the ballot in the next year or two. And there's a lot of support for that in Oklahoma as well. But the legislature, members of the legislature worked, and the Republican Party leadership in particular in the legislature have worked to undermine that ballot initiative when it was being proposed. One of the things that they did was push it to the primary instead of the general election, because they thought that the primary voters would be less favorable to it. And it still passed with 57% support. So I think that illustrates how legislators are still fairly slow to come around to supporting, being on board with this issue.
So are the states watching each other? I know that in Pennsylvania, for example, one of the arguments here has been that, since recreational passed in New Jersey, everybody in Philadelphia and the eastern part of the state is going to be driving over there, and Pennsylvania is going to be losing out on potential revenue. Where do those concerns come in, and maybe has that dynamic changed at all, given that many states are now facing budget crises as a result of COVID-19?
You definitely do see that as more states pass, it does provide both kind of more models that are out there, model legislation. I know that as I watch legislative proceedings across the country, you will see that, certain states will lift up other states as kind of a model, as the model that they would like to have in their state, and often it is, you can kind of see some politics at play there. So a state like Ohio, for example, is one where the reason we have medical marijuana, I really think, is because of the ballot initiative, and in our case, it was a threat of an initiative. It was John Kasich and the Republicans in 2016 looking ahead to the 2016 election, seeing that Marijuana Policy Project was gathering signatures for a big medical marijuana bill and wanting to cut that off, both for kind of the possible ways that a marijuana bill can shape the electorate, but also for their own desire to kind of control it. But John Kasich, who, he ran for president, he's a bit of a show horse, I would say, as a legislator. He kind of signed that in a very subdued, signing session. Like, he really didn't take a victory lap with this policy. And I think that you've seen that same type of tenor across our legislature, and it's really shaped this implementation that's been a bit slow and a bit frustrating, certainly for patients that I've talked to. But states are definitely, learning and gathering information from one another. And I'll also note that I know that, in many of these cases, if the legislature takes it up, they are holding some committee meetings where they're often bringing in representatives from other states to share about their experience, and to talk about, the positives and the negatives.
And let me jump in, since part of the question was about New Jersey. I'd be remiss not to note that, in I think it was October of 2019, the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut actually had a marijuana legalization summit. And the purpose of that summit was to lay a groundwork for collaborating on legalizing marijuana for adult recreational use. There was interest in each of the states and among each of the governors for this, and they're recognizing the spillover effects of any one of them legalizing marijuana. And so now, New Jersey is the first domino to fall. But I mentioned Lieutenant Governor Fetterman in Pennsylvania. He's a very active Twitter user. And throughout the fall campaign, he tweeted frequently about New Jersey. And it really was the spillover argument of how, 40% of Pennsylvania's population is now within a half-hour drive of a state that will have legal adult use marijuana. And he's making that argument that now that Jersey has adopted it, there's a lot more pressure here in Pennsylvania, or at least there's missed opportunity for the state. He focuses a lot on revenue, but also social justice. But we know New York is going to take it up, and Cuomo's likely going to push it next year. And so that also increases the pressure in PA.
Yeah. So to zoom out here and think about this at the federal level, I've seen, kind of in the pundit world, some hot takes about which, if any of the two national parties would take this up in their platform, it would just be a golden ticket. Like they could just ride it to whatever they want at the federal level. I guess what do you guys make of that argument, and how likely do you think it is that we might see any movement on this issue, either medical or recreational, at the national level?
Well, I think in short, Dan and I's sentiment is that we feel like it's probable that something is going to change, but not inevitable just yet. And that is from everything from even, former President Obama essentially saying that he didn't go so far on marijuana policy because he liked this idea of the states being laboratories of democracy, to the fact that it still has at times become a wedge issue. And we saw this during the one of the stimulus rounds during the pandemic, where as the Democrats in the House were trying to move through some legislation that would protect dispensaries and provide some easing on banking and some other types of issues facing the industry, the Republicans kind of made hay out of that. And, kind of had a bit of a, kind of a pithy, rejoinder about what the Democrats were doing, caring more about pot than people, or, something along those lines. And so it still does have a bit of a culture war flashpoint issue. But one thing that we've been thinking about and noting is that as more states move into the fold, and they do run into all kinds of implementation issues that the main problem is related to federal law. As we have 35 states, with medical programs, that means we have 70 U.S. senators that are representing states that have medical marijuana. And so we do wonder if there will be kind of more pressure on these senators to move and really make some federal policy that could solve some of these issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what I immediately thought of are the Democrats when they were putting together the platform. There was a push. There were multiple progressive policy pushes on the platform that didn't pan out. Not including Medicare for all, things like that. But one of them was marijuana legalization, and Joe Biden has kind of come so far as decriminalization, but there's a lot of open questions as to what his administration will do. There's a push to have them unilaterally reschedule, and which DEA and Health and Human Services has the power to do. But I'm guessing that he's going to be fairly cautious on it too. And so we've seen before in marijuana that the winds can shift. What we think now is that this is such a large industry. And again, as Lee mentioned, 35 states, 70 senators. Marijuana is much more. There's a much more developed structure now for the industry and for regulating it. That it doesn't seem likely that the winds would shift in that way. That you would see it go away. But there are still certainly these cultural headwinds there for getting any sort of large federal change.
So, we talked earlier about social justice, and, we know certainly that disproportionately people of color are likely to wind up at various points in the criminal justice system because of drug charges and, these types of things. And I'm wondering if either of you can speak to anything we know about outcomes of states that have legalized marijuana. Have there been changes as far as things like incarceration rates and those types of social justice issues?
One of the consequences of the federal government not moving, and so Dan mentioned a few policies that would really help, including related to banking, access to loans, access to capital, to actually start these businesses, and that's one area where, as the federal government drags their feet, the marijuana industry is going to have some of the same inequalities built into it as other industries do, whether that's, going back to housing and redlining, or the fact that that marijuana, as you mentioned, enforcement has disproportionately impacted communities of color, and that often restricts you from getting access or getting in on the business side of marijuana. But then also, it's such a system that's based on lots of cash, and we also know that just when it comes to access to cash and the average wealth, that too is impacted by race, and so the fact that people going into this industry may not have the same protections that they do in other industries, to file for bankruptcy, to get, a good loan, to establish credit, all of these other things. What we may see is that it's such a high risk to get into the industry that the industry will remain disproportionately white. And whenever the federal government kind of opens up and changes some of these policies, it may be too little too late, because we know that often it's the first companies in the market that kind of swallow up the competitors. And so I think that is one area of social justice that's being talked about, is just kind of on the business model end. And Dan, you can probably speak more to what Pennsylvania's tried to do, and New Jersey and other states.
With medical, the focus of the programs was on a special population. It was on patients, and them getting access to something that's framed as a medicine, right? But when you legalize for the whole adult population, that necessarily brings up questions about, well, what do you do about the war on drugs and the injustices of the war on drugs, and how do you give communities of color access to an industry that they were disproportionately punished for in the past. So it's become a major, social justice issues and how to work out those issues hung up legalization in both New York and New Jersey last year. And that was part of the reason why New Jersey pushed it to a constitutional amendment, so that the legislature could have citizens vote on it to get it passed. And then right now, as we're speaking, New Jersey is struggling through how to actually implement their new recreational program. And a major question is social justice. How is the money going to be spent? How do you make sure that communities of color have access to this new industry? So it has been a major issue with, especially with the legalization of adult recreational use. In terms of the arrests, that's my favorite point on marijuana comes from actually a legal scholar, John Adler, who wrote a book about federalism and marijuana policy. And basically his argument is that nobody has seen what they thought they would with marijuana. So the proponents have not seen the level of revenues in particular that were promised in most of these states. And in terms of the opponents, they haven't seen the rises in addiction and emergency room visits and youth use and all these sorts of things that have been touted as the arguments against legalization. And criminal justice reform has been, I think, one of those where things haven't quite worked out the way we think in our minds. People are still arrested for if they're selling marijuana in a state that has recreational marijuana. If they're not a dispensary owner and not selling it legally, you can still be arrested for that. That's still going to disproportionately impact communities of color. And we're starting to better understand how policy design shapes that. Like a clear one is if the price of marijuana is too high, then there's still a lot of room for a black market. So how states tax and how they regulate also, those design components matter for these outcomes. So the outcome is fairly complex, and I think there's still a lot of research to be done on the impact of these laws on people.
The two of you wrote back in, I believe it was 2017, that you're kind of questioning whether we had reached a tipping point? Is it safe to say that we have reached that tipping point now? And Lee, just as you were saying there, I mean, do you expect that the recreational trajectory is going to continue and maybe get to the level of where medical is currently?
Yes, so we wrote that right after Oklahoma passed their medical bill, because that just really stuck out, that the very conservative state would vote on that in a May primary election, and so that did kind of there were a lot of articles out there saying like, "Whoa, Oklahoma," and kind of what does that mean for kind of the future of this? I think that we're at I don't know how to put it. I would say I think that there's still some risk aversion and from the Biden administration and others to not tackle this at the level that maybe the activists would want it to be tackled. So I don't know if we're at this like tipping point where the federal government's going to kind of knock down all of the hurdles that they've kind of put up over the years. But I do think we're probably at the point of no return, because, if you go back to the 70s where Dan was talking about decriminalization, well, that's just kind of changing your enforcement strategies, right? Like that's just kind of redirecting street level bureaucrats, your police, to enforce or not enforce marijuana law. But now we're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're dealing with real infrastructure. We're dealing with patients that if they were suddenly cut off from access to whatever is alleviating their pain or their symptoms, would be in real harm's way. And so I think for all of those reasons, I think we're at the point of no return, but I'm not quite sure what the tipping point will be or what that will look like.
Yeah, just real quick, there are institutional dynamics here too. I mean, like we said, the initiative has been such an important force, as has legislative referendum, like what New Jersey just had, and that's continuing to be the case for legalization. But as we think about like a tipping point and legalization spreading quickly and broadly, Pennsylvania is a good example. There is no option. There's no citizen option here. The legislature must pass recreational marijuana, and that's going to be a big lift. Like that's going to require, again, probably a bipartisan support. Even if the Democrats would somehow take control of the General Assembly, they're probably not going to have a majority large enough to push something like that through on their own. And so there are some breaking point, or as we think of, there are some breaks there, institutional breaks that eventually get put on as you burn through more of these initiative states, right? As there's fewer and fewer of them. And that was one of the context of that article that we wrote. At that time for medical, there were only 4 direct initiative states left that didn't have it. And now I think there's only 2. So that means that all the other, particularly the southern states that don't have medical, are either going to have the legislature put a referendum out there, or that the legislature is going to have to pass it themselves. And so that certainly slows things down. So I think we're still in this place of, like Lee said, that we're probably past the point of no return, but it also doesn't seem as inevitable as the discussion often assumes.
Yeah. No, that's, I think that's a great way to think about it. And it'll be interesting to see what the legislative appetite is in these states moving forward. But guys, we've hit a lot of things on the Democracy Works bingo card this episode. We hit federalism, ballot measures, institutions, laboratories of democracy, all kinds of things. It's been really great talking with you about all of those things through the lens of marijuana policy. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was a terrific interview. It was nice to hear from Dan and Lee and learn a lot about marijuana policy. Seems to me, Candace, they raise a couple issues that we might want to talk about a little bit more in terms of federalism and in terms of direct democracy.
Yeah, so maybe we can do the last one first. I
Sure.
think, just going back to something that we mentioned and also Dan and Lee mentioned about how, public opinion is all for it. And when it's on the ballot, when it gets there by often citizen initiative, it passes. swimmingly. And so, you know, this gap between what legislators are willing to do and what the public wants them to do is perhaps a problem
Yep, it's really
for,
glaring.
for democracy.
Yeah, and it's not like just because it's not just because something is passed through direct democracy that the legislature doesn't have a role, because in fact they really do. I mean, once these things are passed, they still need to be enacted and implemented. They require action by the legislature in most cases, unless the ballot initiative is extremely detailed. And here's where the intent of the voters can really be distorted.
In the case of marijuana, that people might want it, but then the state has to implement the policy and they still have to shape it. And in some cases, even on the ballot, it's kind of like this ambiguous language that essentially is like, so do you guys want to think about doing this? Or, you know, or not? And then like, okay, so you guys want to think about it. And then there's the issue of, are we going to decriminalize it? Are we going to legalize it? Are we going to allow for sale? Right? All of these things are going to require the legislator to get involved in infrastructure, policy, like really specific nitty gritty matters.
Exactly. I mean, here's also where some of the more interesting inequity issues come up about whether or not the legislature is going to require that a certain number of licenses, for example, go to minority communities. I mean, there's all kinds of things that the legislature can do. It makes me think sometimes about where we are now with abortion policy, because, you know, abortion is legal, but you wouldn't know it in many states, in the South in particular, because the legislatures have set it up in such a way that it might be a legal right, but there are no providers.
Yeah, right. So that it's legal, but it's not accessible.
But it's not
I think
accessible.
that we may see something like this in a number of states as well concerning marijuana policy, because, you know, for example, there are some places where you have your record has to be squeaky clean in order for you to even work, no less like get into the business as an owner.
Yep.
And so I think that there are people who are focusing on the questions of equity to say, we need to focus on this on the front end, because if we just kind of ram it through to, you know, legalize it or decriminalize it without also right. the fact that there are 40,000 people who are in prison because of marijuana charges, that the chances of the legislature going back to, you know, produce some sort of remedy, moving forward is nil. And again, if you deal with that on the back end instead of on the front end, then, you know, people are going to have their businesses up and running. And, you know, wealth accumulates wealth, and it means that people are going to be squeezed out. It is also sometimes the case that folks who are really concerned about questions of equity are doing some of the slowing down in some ways, because they're requesting that the issues of equity get incorporated in on the early end of the policy change than the late end, given how difficult it is to sometimes make changes in policy across the states and in the federal government as well.
Yeah. Of course, the legislators do have an interest in moving this along once the public has supported it, because they're eager for the revenues, even if the revenues are not always turning out to be quite what they thought they'd be. I think this is going to be even more of an issue for the legislatures going forward. I mean, we're about to enter some pretty dark days, I think, for state budgets.
Yeah, with COVID, right? And I think
absolutely.
that it'll be interesting to see if states just figure out, hey, we need another revenue stream. And the way that it's working out in some states is that revenue will just go to other states.
But there's one other federalism issue I do want to raise, and that has to do with this notion of laboratories of democracy, and that states are going to learn from one another. But I actually don't think they've really waited to learn very much about that at all, at least not that I've seen. And that's probably because public opinion is just racing ahead, as is the opportunity for revenues. But am I wrong about that? Has there been more learning that's gone on than I'm giving credit for?
Well, I mean, I think that people were kind of looking to states that were early enactors to see about crime, about addiction, about DUIs, about, you know, child usage, about how to deal with it as far as banks go. And, so I do think that there are a lot of fears about drugs. I mean, so I grew up in the dare, like,
Oh yeah.
they're like, don't do drugs. I grew up in that era too. That's a long era. And, and so people have a lot of preconceived ideas about all sorts of, substances. And so I think the public has also learned about, the dangers and pitfalls and the perils and promises of the policy too. And I think that matters a lot.
Yeah.
So I want to thank Dan Mallinson and Hannah for a really excellent interview, and Jenna as well, always asking the really excellent questions. I think this episode is really good because it touches on so many of our, topics on our Democracy Works bingo card, and also connects to a number of topics that we've discussed in other episodes. So that was great. That was great.
Yeah, you'd almost think they studied here. It was good to see. It was good to hear from them again. And for Democracy Works, I'm Michael Berkman.
And I'm Candace Watt-Smith. Thanks for listening.
Democracy Works is produced by the McCourtney Institute for Democracy at Penn State and WPSU, Central Pennsylvania's NPR station. Our editors are Mark Stitzer, Jen Bortz, and Chris Kugler, and additional support comes from WPSU's Andy Grant, Emily Reddy, Chris Allen, and Craig Johnson. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please consider leaving us a rating and a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.